For 10 years, Daniel Carter believed the smallest coffin he buried held his only child. The hospital had told him the baby didn't survive the night, and his wife held his hand while a doctor explained that sometimes tragedy arrives without warning, without reason, and without mercy. Daniel remembered the cold hospital hallway, the way the fluorescent lights hummed above him, the way his wife's voice trembled when she said the baby was gone. He signed papers he barely understood. He attended a funeral he never thought he would attend. And like many fathers who lose a child before they even get the chance to hold them, Daniel tried to move forward with a hole in his life that never truly closed. Years passed. Grief slowly became routine. But one quiet evening, 10 years later, a knock on his front door shattered everything he thought he knew about his past, his marriage, and the child he believed he had buried. When Daniel opened the door, he didn't see a neighbor, or a delivery driver, or a friend stopping by unannounced. Standing there was a boy no older than 10 years old, thin, nervous, clutching a worn backpack like it was the only thing holding him together. The boy looked up at Daniel with a mixture of fear and determination that didn't belong on a child's face. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Daniel would later say that something about the boy felt strangely familiar, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the eyes. Maybe it was the shape of his face. Maybe it was simply the quiet feeling that life had just shifted in a way he didn't understand yet. Then the boy spoke 5 words that would unravel a decade of lies. "My mom said you're my dad." In that moment, Daniel Carter felt the ground drop beneath him, because the child he believed had died 10 years earlier was suddenly standing on his doorstep asking for him. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how something like this could happen, we have to go back long before the knock on that door, back to a time when Daniel Carter believed he had built the kind of life many people dream about. Daniel grew up in a quiet American town where most families knew each other, and where hard work was often the only thing separating stability from struggle. He wasn't a flashy man. He worked as an electrician, the kind of job that required long hours, steady hands, and patience. People who knew Daniel described him as dependable, quiet, and deeply loyal to the people he loved. But there was one dream Daniel carried with him through his 20s and into his 30s. More than money, more than status, more than anything else, Daniel wanted to become a father. Friends remembered how he would light up whenever someone brought their child to a barbecue or a family gathering. He was the kind of man who believed fatherhood was the most important role a man could ever have. Daniel met the woman who would eventually become his wife at a small gathering hosted by mutual friends. Her name was Emily Carter. She had a confident personality that immediately drew people toward her. Emily was intelligent, quick with conversation, and had a way of making people feel comfortable within minutes of meeting her. Their relationship developed quickly. Within months, they were spending nearly every evening together, talking about the future, sharing plans about the kind of family they hoped to build. Friends described their relationship as stable and affectionate. They bought a modest house together in a quiet neighborhood lined with maple trees and aging sidewalks. To the outside world, they appeared like any other young couple building a life together. Daniel believed he had found the partner who would share every chapter of his future, including the one he had been waiting for most of his life. 2 years after their wedding, Emily told Daniel she was pregnant. Daniel later described that moment as one of the happiest days of his life. He called his parents immediately. He told co-workers the next morning. Within weeks, he had already begun assembling a nursery in the spare bedroom of their home. The walls were painted a soft shade of blue. A small crib sat near the window. Daniel even installed a tiny bookshelf filled with children's stories he remembered from his own childhood. He imagined teaching his son how to ride a bike, helping with homework, and one day watching him grow into a man. Emily seemed happy too, though some people later remembered that she often appeared distant during the pregnancy. At the time, Daniel believed it was simply stress, the normal anxiety that comes with preparing for such a major life change. What he didn't know then was that the story of his child was already taking a path he could never have imagined. Late one night, about a month before Emily's due date, she told Daniel something felt wrong. She complained of severe pain and insisted they needed to go to the hospital immediately. Daniel rushed her into the car and drove through nearly empty streets toward the nearest emergency room. The drive felt endless even though it only lasted 15 minutes. When they arrived, nurses quickly escorted Emily into a delivery room while Daniel was asked to wait outside. Hours passed slowly in the quiet hospital hallway. Daniel paced back and forth, staring at the clock on the wall as every minute stretched into what felt like an hour. Eventually, a doctor stepped into the hallway with a solemn expression. The words that followed were simple but devastating. The baby hadn't survived. Daniel later said he barely remembers what happened in the moments after hearing that sentence. The grief hit him like a wave he couldn't escape. In the days that followed, the hospital handled most of the arrangements. Daniel was told that the baby had been stillborn and that certain procedures would be handled quickly due to hospital policies regarding infant deaths. Emily insisted she didn't want to see the baby, saying it would make the grief unbearable. Daniel trusted her. He trusted the doctors. And so he signed forms that he barely read through tears. A small funeral was arranged. Only a few close relatives attended. Daniel stood beside a tiny casket wondering how something he had waited for his entire life could disappear before he even had the chance to hold it. That moment stayed with him for years. The silence of the funeral, the feeling that his future had been rewritten overnight, the quiet promise he made to himself that he would try to move forward even though a part of him felt permanently broken. Life slowly continued, the way it always does even when people wish it would pause long enough for them to recover. Daniel returned to work. Friends offered sympathy. Months turned into years. But something in his marriage began to change. Emily rarely talked about the baby. She avoided the nursery room completely and insisted the door remain closed. Daniel tried to be supportive, believing they were both simply coping with loss in different ways. Over time, however, emotional distance began to grow between them. Conversations became shorter. Arguments appeared over small things that never used to matter. Daniel wondered if the tragedy had damaged their relationship in ways neither of them fully understood. What he never considered was that the most important part of the story had not ended in that hospital room. In fact, the truth had been hidden in plain sight the entire time, waiting for a moment when it could no longer remain buried. And that moment arrived 10 years later when a young boy knocked on Daniel Carter's door and asked if he was his father. Daniel Carter once believed he had built the kind of life many people spend decades trying to create. He had a steady career, a modest suburban home with a quiet street out front, and a marriage that seemed solid to everyone who knew them. Friends who visited their house often described it as warm and welcoming, the kind of place where laughter filled the living room during weekend dinners, and where plans for the future were discussed with confidence. When Daniel married Emily Carter, he believed he had found someone who wanted the same simple things he did: stability, loyalty, and eventually a family. Looking back now, many people who knew them say the photographs from their wedding still look like something from a perfect memory. Daniel standing proudly in a dark suit, Emily smiling beside him. Friends gathered around them cheering as they began what appeared to be a life filled with promise. But photographs only capture moments. They don't capture the hidden decisions that sometimes change everything. When Emily announced she was pregnant, the excitement surrounding their lives seemed to double overnight. Daniel told everyone he knew that he was finally going to become a father. Co-workers remember him walking into work with a grin that refused to fade. He spent evenings assembling furniture for the nursery and weekends researching the best strollers and car seats. The house that once felt quiet suddenly felt like it was preparing for something much bigger. To Daniel, this was the chapter he had waited for his entire life. A child meant responsibility, but it also meant purpose. The idea that he would soon hear a baby crying in the next room filled him with a kind of happiness he had never experienced before. But while Daniel was busy imagining the future, something was already beginning to unfold that would eventually erase the life he thought he was building. The night they rushed to the hospital remains one of the most painful memories Daniel carries with him. Emily had complained about intense pain and insisted something was wrong. Daniel drove faster than he ever had before, gripping the steering wheel as fear raced through his mind. Hours later, when the doctor walked into the hallway and quietly explained that the baby had not survived, Daniel felt like the world had suddenly stopped moving. Grief consumed him so quickly that the details of that night blurred together. He trusted the hospital staff. He trusted the paperwork placed in front of him. And most of all, he trusted his wife when she said she could not bear the pain of seeing the baby. The funeral that followed felt surreal. A tiny casket lowered into the ground while Daniel stood beside it wondering how a future that once seemed so certain could disappear in a single night. For years afterward, Daniel tried to rebuild his life piece by piece. The nursery door remained closed, eventually becoming just another forgotten room in the house. Friends stopped mentioning the tragedy because they believed Daniel needed space to move forward. Emily rarely spoke about it either, and when she did her voice carried a tone that ended conversations quickly. Their marriage slowly changed in ways Daniel could not fully explain. The warmth that once defined their relationship seemed to fade. Small disagreements became common. Long silences replaced the easy conversations they once shared. Eventually the distance between them grew so wide that their marriage could no longer survive it. The divorce happened quietly, without dramatic arguments or public accusations. Two people who once believed they would spend their lives together simply went their separate ways. Years passed after the divorce. Daniel focused on work and tried to accept the life that remained in front of him. The loss of his child had shaped him into someone more reserved, someone who avoided talking about the past because the memories carried too much weight. But despite everything, he had slowly reached a place where the pain no longer controlled every moment of his day. He believed the hardest chapter of his life had already ended. That belief lasted until the evening a young boy appeared on his doorstep and asked if he was Daniel Carter. What happened next would force Daniel to question every memory he had trusted for the past decade. Because if the child standing at his door was truly his son, it meant something impossible had happened. It meant the hospital had been wrong or someone had lied. It meant the funeral Daniel attended may have been built on a story that was never real. And it meant the woman he once trusted more than anyone else in the world might have been hiding a secret that stretched back 10 years. As Daniel stood in his doorway staring at the boy who claimed to be his child, the questions began forming faster than he could answer them. Did Emily Carter lie about the death of their baby? If the child was alive, who helped keep that secret hidden for an entire decade? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how did this boy manage to find the father he had never known? The truth waiting at the center of those questions would dismantle the life Daniel thought he understood. It would force people to examine how a secret of this magnitude could remain hidden for so long. And it would reveal that the story of Daniel Carter's lost child had never truly ended in that hospital hallway. Instead, it had been quietly continuing somewhere else for 10 years. The deeper investigators looked into the situation, the more complicated the answers became. Documents that should have been clear suddenly raised doubts. Conversations from the past began to carry new meaning. And the more pieces that surfaced, the more one unsettling question refused to disappear. Why would a mother hide her child from his own father for an entire decade? To understand how Daniel Carter reached the moment where a young boy stood on his doorstep claiming to be his son, we have to step back and look at the life he built long before everything began to unravel. Daniel Carter was 38 years old when the truth finally began to surface. But the story really begins years earlier in the quiet working-class town where he grew up. The kind of place where neighbors recognize each other's cars, where children ride bicycles through the same streets their parents once walked, and where most people measure success not by luxury but by stability. Daniel was raised in a family that believed in hard work and loyalty above everything else. His father worked long hours fixing machinery at a local factory, and his mother held together a household where responsibility was expected from an early age. Those values stayed with Daniel as he grew older. He never chased attention or status. Instead, he focused on building a steady life through patience and discipline. By the time he reached his 30s, Daniel had established himself as a reliable electrician. The job demanded precision, long days on construction sites, and a willingness to climb into tight spaces most people avoided. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and allowed him to slowly build the life he imagined for himself. Coworkers often described him as the type of man you could count on without hesitation. If something needed to be done properly, Daniel would stay late to finish it. If someone needed help, he rarely turned them away. But beyond the routine of work and daily responsibilities, Daniel carried a quiet dream that shaped how he viewed the future. More than wealth, more than recognition, Daniel wanted to be a father. People who knew him well noticed how his face softened whenever he talked about children. At family gatherings, he would spend time playing with nieces and nephews while others stood nearby talking. To him, fatherhood represented something deeper than simply raising a child. It meant guiding another life, passing on the lessons he had learned growing up, and creating the kind of family stability that had shaped his own childhood. Daniel met Rebecca Carter during a casual gathering organized by mutual friends one autumn evening. Rebecca had a presence that people noticed immediately. She spoke confidently, carried herself with natural charm, and had the ability to make conversations feel effortless. Where Daniel was quiet and reserved, Rebecca was expressive and ambitious. The contrast between their personalities seemed to balance them in ways that felt natural at the time. They began spending more time together after that first meeting, often meeting at coffee shops or walking through local parks where conversations stretched late into the evening. Daniel admired Rebecca's determination and intelligence. She spoke about wanting to build something meaningful in her life, about achieving independence and success through her own efforts. For Daniel, who valued loyalty and commitment above everything else, Rebecca appeared to be someone who shared his vision for the future. Their relationship progressed quickly. Within months, they were inseparable. Rebecca began spending evenings at Daniel's home, and weekends were filled with small trips to nearby towns or quiet dinners, where they talked about the life they hoped to build together. Friends who watched their relationship unfold often described them as balanced. Daniel's calm personality seemed to ground Rebecca's ambition, while Rebecca's energy encouraged Daniel to think bigger about what his future could look like. After 2 years of dating, Daniel proposed during a simple dinner at a small restaurant they both loved. Rebecca accepted without hesitation. Their wedding followed several months later, attended by family members and close friends who genuinely believed they were witnessing the beginning of a strong and lasting partnership. Photographs from that day show two people smiling with confidence, surrounded by people who believed they were watching a couple destined to succeed together. The early years of their marriage appeared stable from the outside. Daniel continued working as an electrician while Rebecca pursued her own professional goals. They purchased a modest home in a quiet suburban neighborhood where tree-lined streets and tidy lawns created an atmosphere of calm routine. Neighbors often saw them walking together in the evenings or working side by side on small home improvements. Friends who visited their house remember laughter in the kitchen and long conversations around the dining table. To most people who knew them, Daniel and Rebecca Carter looked like the kind of couple who had everything under control. Their personalities complemented each other in ways that seemed healthy and supportive. If there were disagreements or tensions, they never appeared serious enough for anyone to notice. But beneath all of the normal routines of marriage, Daniel still carried the dream he had held since his 20s. He wanted a child. Though the couple never rushed the conversation publicly, Daniel occasionally mentioned to friends that he hoped they would start a family soon. Rebecca usually responded with a smile, assuring him that the time would come when they were both ready. Eventually, that moment seemed to arrive during the second year of their marriage. One evening, Rebecca returned home with news that immediately changed the atmosphere of their entire household. She told Daniel she was pregnant. The reaction Daniel had in that moment is something friends still remember clearly when they talk about him. He was overwhelmed with excitement. The idea that he was finally going to become a father felt like the fulfillment of a promised life had been building toward for years. From that moment forward, Daniel approached the coming months with enthusiasm that touched every corner of their home. He began preparing the spare bedroom that would soon become a nursery. Weekends were spent assembling furniture, painting walls, and researching everything a new father might need to know. He studied baby monitors, strollers, and safety equipment with the same attention he normally gave to electrical diagrams at work. Co-workers often joked that Daniel talked about the baby more than anyone else in the building. But he didn't mind. For him, every small preparation represented a step closer to the future he had always imagined. Rebecca appeared supportive of the excitement, though some people later recalled that she occasionally seemed distracted during conversations about the baby. At the time, Daniel interpreted those moments as normal anxiety. After all, becoming a parent is a life-changing experience, and everyone processes that responsibility differently. As the pregnancy progressed, Daniel continued preparing their home for the arrival of their child. The nursery slowly filled with baby clothes, soft blankets, and a small crib positioned near the window. Daniel even placed a rocking chair in the corner, imagining the nights he would spend there comforting his child during those first difficult months. To Daniel, the house no longer felt like just a place to live. It felt like the beginning of a family story that would grow over decades. Every ultrasound appointment, every doctor visit, every small milestone during the pregnancy strengthened his belief that the life he had worked so hard to build was finally reaching its most meaningful chapter. But according to Rebecca Carter, the story of that pregnancy would end in tragedy. And the explanation she gave Daniel on one cold night at the hospital would become the foundation for a lie that managed to survive for 10 years before finally collapsing in the most unexpected way possible. Late one night, when the air outside had grown unusually cold and the streets were nearly empty, Rebecca Carter told Daniel that something felt wrong. Her voice carried a level of urgency Daniel had never heard before. She said the pain had started suddenly and that it was getting worse by the minute. Daniel did not hesitate. He grabbed his car keys, helped Rebecca into the passenger seat, and drove toward the nearest hospital with a sense of fear building in his chest. The drive felt longer than it actually was. Every red light felt like an obstacle standing between him and the safety of the doctors waiting ahead. Rebecca leaned back in her seat holding her stomach while Daniel kept glancing at her between the road and the dashboard clock. The nursery room at home had been ready for weeks, filled with baby clothes and quiet anticipation. And now Daniel was racing through dark streets hoping the child he had been waiting for would arrive safely. When they finally reached the hospital, nurses quickly placed Rebecca on a wheelchair and rolled her through a set of doors leading into the maternity ward. Daniel followed for a few steps until a staff member gently stopped him and explained that he needed to wait outside while the medical team handled the situation. The hallway where Daniel sat felt unusually silent. A television mounted on the wall played a late-night program no one seemed to be watching. Every so often a nurse walked past carrying paperwork or pushing equipment down the corridor. Daniel sat in a plastic chair staring at the closed doors, imagining the moment he would finally hear the cry of his child. Minutes slowly turned into hours. Each time footsteps echoed down the hallway, Daniel stood up expecting someone to call his name. Instead, the hallway returned to silence again and again. Eventually, a doctor walked toward him with an expression that Daniel would later say he never forgot. It was the kind of look that carried sympathy before a single word was spoken. The doctor sat beside him and spoke quietly, explaining that Rebecca had delivered the baby, but that the child had not survived the complications during birth. For a moment, Daniel simply stared at the floor, trying to process what he had just heard. The words seemed impossible to accept. Only hours earlier, he had been driving to the hospital expecting to become a father. Now he was being told that the future he had imagined was gone before it had even begun. Daniel covered his face with his hands and began to cry in a way he never had before. The sound echoed softly through the empty hallway, while the doctor remained seated beside him, offering words of comfort that barely registered in Daniel's mind. The hospital staff moved quickly through procedures that Daniel struggled to follow. Papers were placed in front of him to sign. Staff members explained policies about stillborn births and the arrangements that needed to be made. Daniel nodded through conversations that felt distant and unreal. Rebecca remained inside the maternity room while nurses moved back and forth handling paperwork and documentation. When Daniel asked if he could see the baby, Rebecca later told him she could not handle the pain of looking at their child after what had happened. She said it would destroy her emotionally if they both went through that moment. Daniel trusted her judgment because the grief in her voice sounded genuine. In the state he was in, he believed protecting Rebecca from further pain was the right decision. Within a few days, the hospital helped arrange a small funeral service. Only a handful of close relatives attended. The ceremony took place in a quiet cemetery under a gray sky that seemed to mirror the mood of everyone standing there. Daniel remembered the weight of the moment more than the details. A small casket lowered into the ground while he stood beside Rebecca, trying to accept that his child's life had ended before it even had the chance to begin. Friends offered words of support, telling him that time would eventually make the pain easier to carry. But Daniel knew that something fundamental had changed inside him. The dream of fatherhood he had spent years preparing for had disappeared in a single night. The months that followed were filled with quiet attempts to rebuild normal routines. Daniel returned to work, though co-workers noticed he was more reserved than before. Rebecca also seemed changed by the loss. She rarely spoke about the baby and often became emotional if the topic surfaced unexpectedly. Daniel tried to be patient, believing that both of them were simply processing grief in their own way. The nursery room remained untouched for a long time, its door closed as if opening it would release memories neither of them were ready to face. Life slowly continued, but something about the situation began to feel unsettled as time passed. Several months after the funeral, Daniel started noticing small details that didn't quite make sense. When he occasionally tried to talk about the baby or ask questions about the night at the hospital, Rebecca would quickly change the subject or say she didn't want to relive the experience. At first, Daniel respected her request, believing that avoiding painful memories was part of healing. But over time, her reluctance became more intense. She refused to discuss even the simplest details of the birth or the hospital visit. When Daniel tried reviewing some of the paperwork from that night, he noticed that many of the documents seemed unusually brief or unclear about specific details. Some records that he expected to see were missing entirely. When he asked Rebecca if she remembered signing certain forms, she would respond with short answers before steering the conversation in another direction. Daniel also noticed a growing emotional distance between them. Rebecca spent more time away from home, often explaining that work responsibilities were demanding more of her schedule. Their conversations became shorter and less personal. The closeness they once shared seemed to fade gradually, replaced by long silences and conversations that felt forced. Daniel occasionally wondered whether the loss of their child had damaged their relationship in ways neither of them fully understood. He tried suggesting counseling, hoping it might help them process the grief together. Rebecca declined, insisting that time was the only thing that could help her move forward. Despite these concerns, Daniel never considered the possibility that the story he had been told about that night might not be completely true. In his mind, the hospital had confirmed the tragedy, the funeral had provided closure, and Rebecca had simply been coping with pain in her own way. The idea that anything else could be hiding beneath those events never crossed his mind. For years, he continued living with the belief that his child had died before he ever had the chance to become a father. But what Daniel Carter didn't know was that the story he believed was only half true. Somewhere beyond the life he thought he understood, a secret had been quietly growing for 10 years, waiting for the moment when it could no longer stay hidden. And when that moment finally arrived, it would begin with something as simple as a knock on his front door. In the months that followed the loss of their baby, Daniel Carter tried to convince himself that grief was simply something couples learn to carry together. At first, he believed time would slowly soften the weight of what had happened in that hospital hallway. But instead of bringing them closer, the silence surrounding that night began creating distance between him and Rebecca Carter. Conversations that once felt natural now ended quickly. Rebecca spent long hours alone in the bedroom or on the phone in other parts of the house. Whenever Daniel asked if something was wrong, she usually responded with a quiet assurance that she was just tired or overwhelmed. Daniel accepted those explanations because the alternative was too painful to consider. Losing a child affects people in different ways, and Daniel believed Rebecca was simply processing the tragedy in her own private way. As the months slowly turned into years, Rebecca's behavior continued to change. She became increasingly protective of her phone, often stepping outside or leaving the room before answering calls. Some weekends she told Daniel she needed time to clear her mind and would disappear for several hours without explaining where she had gone. Daniel noticed these changes but struggled to interpret them clearly. Part of him suspected there might be someone else in her life, an affair that had grown out of the emotional distance between them. Another part of him wondered if Rebecca was dealing with depression or trauma that she simply couldn't explain out loud. Losing a child can fracture people in ways that are difficult to understand from the outside. Daniel told himself that patience and support were the only ways forward. Despite his concerns, Daniel never imagined that the truth behind Rebecca's behavior could be connected to the baby they had lost. To him, that chapter of their life had already closed. The hospital had confirmed the tragedy. The funeral had happened. The grief had shaped both of them in ways they were still learning to live with. Whenever the thought of their child surfaced in Daniel's mind, it came with a quiet sense of finality. He believed the story had ended that night in the hospital. What he didn't realize was that the story had continued in a direction he had never been allowed to see. 7 years passed before the strain on their marriage finally reached a point where neither of them could ignore it any longer. The arguments that once appeared occasionally became more frequent. Silence replaced the laughter that had once filled their home. Eventually, the conversations shifted toward something neither of them had expected when they first stood together at their wedding: divorce. The process unfolded quietly without dramatic confrontations. Both of them seemed emotionally exhausted by the years of distance that had grown between them. Legal documents were signed. Property was divided. And the life they once shared slowly separated into two different paths. After the divorce, Rebecca Carter moved to another city several hours away. She explained that the move would give her a chance to start over somewhere new. Daniel didn't argue with the decision. By that point, he had grown used to the idea that some parts of his life were simply beyond repair. Their marriage had ended, but Daniel still carried the emotional weight of losing the child he never had the chance to meet. That grief never fully disappeared. It remained quietly present in small moments throughout his life. When he passed by the closed nursery room that still existed in his house. When he saw fathers playing with their children in parks. When coworkers talked about their kids learning to ride bikes or graduating from school. Daniel continued working as an electrician and focused on rebuilding a routine that felt stable again. Years moved forward slowly but steadily. The pain of the past never vanished completely, but it became something he learned to live beside rather than something that controlled every day of his life. Eventually, Daniel reached a point where he believed the most difficult chapter of his story was behind him. The tragedy at the hospital, the collapse of his marriage, the years of uncertainty that followed. He believed those events belonged to the past, until something impossible happened. It was a quiet evening when the knock came at Daniel's front door. The neighborhood was calm, the kind of peaceful suburban street where unexpected visitors rarely appeared after dark. Daniel walked toward the door expecting to see a neighbor or perhaps someone delivering a package to the wrong address. When he opened it, he found himself staring at a young boy standing on the porch. The child looked about 10 years old. He held a worn backpack over one shoulder and shifted nervously from one foot to the other. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel looked around the street, half expecting an adult to appear nearby explaining the situation. The boy finally broke the silence. His voice carried a mixture of hesitation and determination. He asked a simple question that immediately caught Daniel off guard. "Are you Daniel Carter?" The question felt strange coming from someone so young, but Daniel nodded anyway. The boy studied his face carefully, as if confirming something he had been searching for. Then he spoke again, and the words that followed struck Daniel with the force of something completely unimaginable. The boy looked directly at him and said, "My mom said you're my dad." For several seconds Daniel simply stared at him, unsure whether he had heard the sentence correctly. His mind began racing through explanations that might make sense of the situation. Perhaps the boy had mistaken him for someone else. Perhaps it was some kind of prank arranged by neighborhood kids. Daniel asked the boy who his mother was, expecting a name he had never heard before. Instead, the answer felt like a sudden shock that sent his thoughts into complete confusion. The boy calmly said his mother's name was Rebecca Carter. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Rebecca Carter was the woman he had been married to for years. Rebecca Carter was the woman who had stood beside him in a hospital hallway and told him their baby had died. Daniel tried to keep his voice steady as he asked the boy where he had come from and why he believed Daniel was his father. The child quietly reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded document that looked worn from being carried around for a long time. It was a birth certificate. Daniel unfolded the paper and immediately recognized the name printed on it. The child's mother was listed as Rebecca Carter. The date of birth matched the exact time period when Daniel believed his child had died. His hands began to tremble slightly as he stared at the document, struggling to understand how such a record could exist if the baby he was expecting had been declared dead 10 years earlier. The boy explained that he had recently discovered the document among some papers at home and had started asking questions about his father. According to him, Rebecca had eventually told him Daniel's name. Daniel still couldn't accept the possibility that the child standing in front of him might actually be his son. The situation felt too impossible to believe without proof. After several long conversations and careful discussions with legal advisors, Daniel arranged for a DNA test that would finally answer the question neither of them could ignore. The waiting period for the results felt endless. Every day Daniel found himself thinking about the possibility that his entire understanding of the past 10 years might be wrong. When the results finally arrived, the truth was impossible to deny. The test confirmed a genetic match of 99.9%. The boy standing at Daniel Carter's door was not a stranger, not a prank, and not a mistake. He was Daniel's son.
The DNA results left no room for doubt, yet they created more questions than Daniel Carter could process all at once. For 10 years he had lived with the belief that his child had died before he ever had the chance to hold him. Now the test in his hands was telling him that the boy who had appeared at his door was his biological son. The discovery brought a strange mixture of emotions rushing through him. Relief, anger, disbelief, and confusion collided in a way that made it difficult to think clearly. Daniel knew there was only one person who could explain how something like this had happened. Rebecca Carter, the woman who had once stood beside him in a hospital hallway and told him their child was gone. Within days of receiving the DNA results, Daniel contacted Rebecca and demanded answers about the secret that had suddenly emerged after a decade of silence. When Rebecca first heard why Daniel wanted to speak with her, she reacted with denial. She insisted that the situation must be some kind of misunderstanding. She questioned the accuracy of the DNA test and suggested that someone might be manipulating Daniel for reasons neither of them understood. Her voice remained calm, almost defensive, as she tried to dismiss the possibility that the child could truly be his. But Daniel had spent too many years living with grief to accept vague explanations now. He reminded Rebecca about the birth certificate the boy had shown him, about the matching dates, and about the genetic test confirming what he already feared. The more Daniel pressed for the truth, the more Rebecca's confidence began to fade. Silence slowly replaced the firm denial she had started with. Eventually Rebecca admitted there was something she had never told him about the night their child was born. At first her explanation came in fragments, hesitant and uncertain, as if she was struggling to decide how much of the truth she could reveal. But the longer the conversation continued, the more the story began to take shape. The revelation Daniel heard that day would force him to question every memory he carried from that night at the hospital. According to Rebecca, the baby had never died. The child Daniel believed had been buried 10 years earlier had actually survived the birth without the complications she had described. The hospital staff had delivered a healthy baby boy. Daniel listened in silence as Rebecca explained that the tragedy he had mourned for a decade had been built on a lie she had carefully created. Rebecca admitted that in the weeks leading up to the birth, she had begun doubting the future she and Daniel were building together. She described feeling trapped by responsibilities she believed would eventually limit her independence. She said she had started questioning whether Daniel was the kind of father she wanted raising her child. According to Rebecca, she believed Daniel's personality was too rigid, too focused on routine and control. In her mind, he represented a life she was no longer sure she wanted. Those doubts grew stronger as the pregnancy progressed. Instead of discussing those concerns openly, Rebecca began considering a drastic solution that would allow her to raise the child on her own terms. On the night they arrived at the hospital, Rebecca had already decided that Daniel would never be part of the child's life. She told him the pain she felt was an emergency, but according to her later confession, the situation was never as severe as she had described. When the baby was delivered successfully, Rebecca made a request that shocked Daniel when he finally heard about it years later. She asked a hospital staff member to help alter the official records surrounding the birth. Exactly how that agreement was arranged remains unclear, but Rebecca admitted that someone inside the hospital assisted her in modifying the documentation. Daniel's name was removed from certain forms. Records that would normally list the father were left incomplete. The story Rebecca presented to Daniel about a stillborn child was supported by paperwork that had been deliberately altered. After leaving the hospital, Rebecca continued maintaining the story she had created. She allowed Daniel to believe the baby had died and participated in the small funeral arranged shortly afterward. Within a few years, the distance between them grew large enough that their marriage collapsed entirely. Once the divorce was finalized, Rebecca moved to another city where she began raising the child alone. She built a new life where Daniel's existence remained hidden from the boy who was growing up under her care. For 10 years, Rebecca maintained complete control over the narrative surrounding the child's birth. As far as Daniel was concerned, his son had died. As far as the boy understood growing up, his father simply didn't exist. But secrets built on silence have a way of eventually revealing themselves. When the child turned 10 years old, curiosity began leading him toward questions Rebecca could no longer avoid. One afternoon, the boy discovered a folder of old documents while searching through storage boxes inside their home. Among those papers was a copy of his birth certificate and several records that Rebecca had kept hidden for years. The name Daniel Carter appeared on some of those documents, even though Rebecca had rarely spoken about the boy's father. Confused and increasingly curious, the child began asking questions Rebecca struggled to answer. At first, she tried offering vague explanations, suggesting that his father was someone who had disappeared from their lives long ago. But the boy continued searching for clearer answers. Eventually, Rebecca realized that continuing to hide the truth might create even greater problems. The boy had already discovered Daniel's name, and it was only a matter of time before curiosity pushed him to look further. Reluctantly, she told him that Daniel Carter was his biological father. What she did not expect was how determined the boy would become once he learned that information. Children growing up in the digital age often find answers faster than adults anticipate. Using simple online searches and public records, the boy managed to locate information connected to Daniel's name. Piece by piece, he followed the trail until he discovered the address of the house where Daniel still lived. One afternoon, he packed a small backpack, left home quietly, and traveled across town to the address he had found online. The journey took longer than he expected, but the determination to meet the father he had never known kept him moving forward. When he finally reached the house and knocked on the front door, he had no way of knowing how dramatically that moment would change both of their lives. The boy simply wanted to see the man whose name had appeared in the documents he had discovered. He wanted answers to questions Rebecca had struggled to explain. What happened after Daniel opened that door set off a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. The truth about Rebecca's decision had finally surfaced, but the consequences of that secret were only beginning to unfold. Because once the story reached authorities and legal investigators, it became clear that Rebecca's actions might involve more than just a personal betrayal. Altered hospital records, falsified documents, and the deliberate separation of a father from his child raised serious legal questions that could not be ignored. And as officials began examining the details of what had happened 10 years earlier, another unsettling possibility emerged. The story was not finished yet.
Once the truth about Rebecca Carter's secret was finally revealed, Daniel Carter faced a decision that would shape the rest of his life. For 10 years, he had believed his child was gone forever. Now that same child was alive, standing directly in front of him, carrying the weight of a lie that had shaped both of their lives in ways neither of them chose. Daniel understood that the situation could not simply be resolved with a private conversation. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too many decisions had been made without his knowledge or consent. Within weeks of learning the truth, Daniel began working with legal advisors to determine what actions could be taken against Rebecca and anyone who may have helped carry out the deception. The legal process began slowly, as investigators reviewed documents connected to the hospital visit that had taken place a decade earlier. Attorneys examined the paperwork Daniel had signed the night Rebecca gave birth and compared it with the documents the boy had discovered years later. What they found raised serious concerns about how certain records had been handled. Some forms appeared incomplete. Others showed signs that information had been removed or altered after the birth. While the full details were difficult to reconstruct after so many years, the evidence suggested that something about the official documentation surrounding the birth had not followed standard medical procedures. Based on those discoveries, Daniel filed a legal case seeking accountability for the deception that had separated him from his son for 10 years. Several possible charges were discussed during the early stages of the investigation. Fraud was considered due to the false narrative surrounding the baby's death. Falsifying official documents became another major concern as attorneys reviewed the hospital paperwork that had supported Rebecca's story. Parental interference was also raised, since Daniel had been deliberately prevented from having any role in his child's life despite being the biological father. The legal arguments surrounding the case quickly became complex because the situation involved not only the actions of Rebecca Carter but also the possibility that a hospital staff member had assisted in altering records. While the investigation continued, the court faced a difficult question that went far beyond legal technicalities. At the center of the case was a 10-year-old boy whose entire life had been built around the reality Rebecca had created. From the moment he was born, Rebecca had been the only parent he knew. She had raised him, cared for him, and guided his childhood without Daniel ever being present. Judges and legal experts reviewing the situation understood that simply punishing Rebecca without considering the boy's emotional well-being could create new harm. Removing him completely from the mother who had raised him might cause confusion and trauma that no court decision could easily repair. Because of that concern, the legal proceedings gradually shifted toward a solution that balanced accountability with the child's stability. Daniel Carter had already lost 10 years with his son, and there was no way to return that time. The court recognized that denying him the chance to build a relationship with the boy would only continue the injustice that had already taken place. At the same time, completely separating the child from Rebecca would introduce another form of disruption into a life that had already been shaped by secrecy. After months of hearings and negotiations, the court reached a decision designed to protect the child while acknowledging Daniel's rights as a father. Shared custody was granted, allowing Daniel to become part of his son's life while still preserving the bond the boy had with his mother. The arrangement created a new structure where both parents would share responsibility for raising him moving forward. Alongside that decision, authorities continued examining the circumstances surrounding the altered hospital records to determine whether disciplinary actions or further legal consequences were appropriate for anyone involved in manipulating official documents. For Daniel, the court's decision marked the beginning of a chapter he had once believed was impossible. The first months of getting to know his son were filled with cautious steps as both of them adjusted to a relationship that should have started years earlier. At first, their conversations felt awkward, as if two strangers were trying to learn about each other's lives from the beginning. But slowly those moments began turning into genuine memories. Daniel attended his son's first baseball game as a spectator, standing near the fence while watching him run across the field with the energy only children possess. Later they took their first father and son road trip, driving through quiet highways while sharing stories about school, hobbies, and the small details that normally unfold naturally during childhood. Each new experience carried a bittersweet feeling for Daniel. He felt grateful that the opportunity to be part of his son's life had finally arrived, but he also knew that 10 years of missed birthdays, missed milestones, and missed moments could never be recovered. Those lost years remained a silent reminder of the deception that had shaped both of their lives. Still, Daniel focused on the future rather than the past. Every conversation, every shared activity, every quiet moment together became a chance to build the relationship that had been delayed for far too long. 10 years had been taken from him, years that could never be returned. But the years ahead were finally his to experience as a father. The bond between Daniel Carter and his son continued growing slowly, shaped by patience and a shared determination to move forward rather than remain trapped by what had already happened. What began with a knock on a quiet suburban door had transformed into a story that revealed just how fragile trust can be when secrets remain hidden for too long. One lie had kept a father from his child for an entire decade. A lie strong enough to survive hospital records, legal documents, and years of silence. Yet even the most carefully constructed secrets eventually reach a moment where the truth refuses to stay hidden any longer. And as Daniel Carter's story shows, the consequences of that truth often raise questions that don't have easy answers. Would you forgive someone who hid your child from you? Daniel Carter's story leaves behind a question that many people struggle to answer when they hear what happened. For 10 years, he believed his son had died before he ever had the chance to hold him. For 10 years, he mourned a child who was actually growing up somewhere else, learning to walk, learning to speak, learning to live a life his father never knew existed. Rebecca Carter made a decision that changed the course of 3 lives in a single night. Some people believe she acted out of fear and a desire to raise her child the way she thought was best. Others believe the deception was too severe to ever be justified. When a parent hides a child from the other parent for an entire decade, the consequences reach far beyond a broken relationship. They shape a childhood, they reshape a family, and they leave behind questions that continue long after the truth comes out. Now that you've heard the full story of Daniel Carter and Rebecca Carter, we want to hear what you think about the choices that led to this moment. Do you believe Rebecca deserved the legal consequences she faced? Or do you think she believed she was protecting her child from a future she feared? Could any situation justify hiding a child from their father for 10 years? Or should the truth have been revealed long before that knock on Daniel's door ever happened? Stories like this remind us how complicated family decisions can become when fear, trust, and control collide. Everyone watching may see the situation differently, and that's exactly why your voice matters here. Take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done if you were in Daniel Carter's position? Would you have fought for justice the same way he did, or would forgiveness have played a larger role in your decision? Conversations like these often reveal how differently people interpret the same story, and reading your perspective might help someone else see the situation in a new way. And if you thought this story was shocking, the next case we're covering will leave you questioning how someone can vanish without a trace for more than a decade. It's the story of a woman who disappeared for 15 years while her family searched for answers, until one ordinary day when a stranger recognized her face on an old missing person poster and realized she had been living under a completely different identity. The discovery that followed uncovered secrets that had been hidden for years and revealed how an entire life had been rebuilt around a false name. If stories like this fascinate you, stories where real people find themselves caught in situations that feel almost impossible to believe, make sure you stay connected with this channel. Subscribe so you never miss the next investigation, because the stories we bring here are not fiction. They are real events that happen to real people, and sometimes the truth behind them is far more surprising than anything anyone could invent.